So, yesterday we imagined what it would be like to live in a time that didn't have all the inventions that we know and love and make our life comfortable. So, we are entering the Industrial Revolution of our U.S. history. And this is a time where we focus on inventions that really changed America. Today, you're going to read this at the conclusion where you can see this picture here, some young girls working long hours. You're going to read this, and then you are going to answer 4 questions at the end of the lesson today. Let's take a look at this chart. It's the history of the Industrial Revolution. And so we're going to start, it'll show us the years that we experienced this Industrial Revolution. So around the year 1781 all the way to 1869. I know that's a lot of years. Why don't you just take a minute and try to figure out how many years that is? Well, it goes from 1700 to 1800. So kind of close to 100 years, not quite that long, but it was an entire century worth of inventions. And that's what we're going to take a look at, this Industrial Revolution. Okay, so Eli Whitney is someone we're going to talk about who created interchangeable parts to build rifles. 1790, it begins the first textile mill, and we'll talk about what that means. In 1973, Eli Whitney again creates something spectacular called the cotton gin. And Robert Fulton built a steamboat in 1807. That was a big deal. And in 1825, they completed the Erie Canal, which opened a whole water route from the Great Lakes, that's at the top of the United States, to New York City, which was a big deal. And in 1831, the mechanical reaper. Yep, it's exactly what you think it is. When you think of the reaper at Halloween, there was actually a tool called the reaper with that big long blade. We'll talk about that. I think all of you know that name, John Deere. He invented the steel plow. And then in 1844, can you imagine hearing about the telegraph? The first time you could send a message to someone. We'll talk about that too. We'll talk about the Bessemer process, which makes steel. And it makes it cheap, but very strong, which changed some things. And then they completed the Transcontinental Railroad. That was the railroad, remember, that runs all the way from the east, or the 13 colonies, South Carolina area, all the way across the United States, through mountains, all the way to California. So, a steamboat may not seem like a big deal to you, but before there was the steamboat, people traveled on the river, and they were just dependent on the river currents moving them, or hopefully a big gust of wind, or manpower kind of rowing boats. But the steam-powered boats changed travel forever. The steamboat allowed people to move things up and down the river really quickly. This encouraged more factories to build and produce more goods, and steamboats led to growth of cities like New Orleans and St. Louis. So the first successful steamboat was called the Clermont, which was built by the inventor Robert Fulton in 1807. All right, this may not look that important to you, but the cotton gin was a big deal. The cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney in 1793. When you pick cotton, it is full of seeds. I don't know if you know that. And you have to pick out every little tiny piece of seed. Before this invention, you had to remove the cotton seeds by hand. It required so much time and labor. The cotton gin, you put the cotton in it, and it uses wire and other small hooks, and it pulls the cotton out while it removes the seeds. Now, cotton farmers were able to sell cotton to more people faster, and it increased their profits, and But on a negative side, it led to a large rise of slavery in the South because those farmers needed to use enslaved African Americans to grow even more cotton because the demand for cotton was getting greater and it increased the farmers' profits. So the invention of the cotton gin was great and encouraged cotton farmers to move farther west. And as the farmers moved west, unfortunately, so did slavery. Now, you might not have any idea what this means, but it's a process of making steel. It was first used in New York in 1865, and up until now, it had been very expensive to make steel, but the Bessemer process made it easy. That's what you need to know. It made it easy and it made it cheap. So, steel improved everything. Steel improved the railroads. Steel lasted 10 times longer than iron. Steel rails could carry heavier trains. This was a big invention. The mechanical reaper and steel plow. I don't know if you can see that in the pictures below, all the reapers. But the steel plow was invented by John Deere in 1837. And this plow allowed farmers to quickly plow the ground and plant seeds. So they could grow more crops in a less amount of time, which means more money. So you can see all the amazing things that were happening because of these inventions. The people were getting more and more successful, and they could grow more, and they could build more, and they could do more. And that was great. But it kind of changed that simple life that Amelia Earhart talked about in your story today. How she talked about how she remembers simple times. Things get busy. The world gets busy. And about making more profit and money. So that mechanical reaper up here, was a steel plow that changed farming. And it was actually invented by Cyrus McCormick in 1834. So before the mechanical reaper, farmers had to gather crops by hand. But this took a long time. So this was a really big invention that changed the lives of many people. Canals are waterways that were built to move things across the United States quickly. So once these canals, I know that wasn't necessarily an invention, but as they completed the Erie Canals, this changed America because it helped settlers move west. It made New York City a very important business city. It did all sorts of things. Of course, the railroad was a big deal. Before the railroad, we had the Pony Express where they were passing letters. So if you sent a letter to your son in California telling him to come see you because you're dying, by the time he got that letter, you'd been dead, buried, and for weeks. But with the railroad, things could move faster, including mail and supplies, and it really changed things. The telegraph and the Morse code was pretty awesome. It might not sound that great to you, but when I get back on Thursday, we're going to take a look at the Morse code and how it worked. But basically, through wires, they figured a way to make this noise where you tapped. And so Thursday, we'll take a look at how you tapped certain messages. So the telegraph isn't like the telephone where you were sending recorded or sound messages using words, but it was a code. So I could send to my son in California instantly a code that said something like, come quick, mom's sick. And they could figure it out using the Morse code. Kind of like what y'all do when you do escape rooms and you have to match the code to the letter. That's kind of what it was like. I think you'll like learning about it. And you might think this is silly, but interchangeable parts, big deal. They were important to factories because interchangeable parts are parts that are created to be identical each time. And they're made the same so that they'll fit into any machine. So when things broke, it was so much easier to fix. Eli Whitney created this first set of interchangeable parts for guns in 1801. Because before, guns were built by these gunsmiths, and each gun was unique. So if you needed a certain part, you had to replace the entire weapon. But now you just could replace the parts. But it also allowed people to repair things and created more jobs, and eventually helped American industries like clockmakers and mechanical reaper and typewriter, so that when things broke, you could just order a part instead of the whole thing. Can you imagine? Imagine your car, or when your dishwasher breaks, or um, sometimes cell phones just need new batteries. But living back then, everything was created and unique, and when you broke it, you just had to get a whole new one. So this is a big deal. So I'm curious, as you are thinking about this, which invention do you think was the most important at the time? So if you would, on a sheet of paper, I'd like you to draw an arrow, and on one side, I want you to write most important, and on the other end, least important. And then I want you to tell me what you think about some of these inventions and which things you thought were super important and maybe not so much. We'll talk about this when I get back. After you've done this activity, be sure to read the passage that I have placed in Google Classroom and answer those questions for me.